In the dim glow of a Manhattan evening, long before the Mafia became a household word and long before Hollywood turned gangsters into icons, a quiet revolution was already taking shape. It did not begin with an explosion or a blood-soaked street. It began with a whisper, a simple idea in the mind of a young immigrant who learned early that the world only respected the man who wrote the rules, not the one who followed them. That whisper belonged to a man who would grow into one of the most influential architects of the American underworld, Lucky Luciano. Picture a smoke-filled backroom in the early 1930s. The city outside pulses with restless ambition, neon lights flickering against wet sidewalks, taxis honking through the night, and the dull hum of machinery echoing from the factories that never sleep. Inside, powerful men gather around a table, each representing a fragment of the criminal world. Their faces are carved with years of violence, betrayal, and restless hunger for dominance. Yet tonight something is different. They wait not for orders born from tradition or the rigid old-world hierarchy. They wait for direction from a man who understands them better than they understand themselves. He steps into the room with measured confidence. His suit is sharp, his expression calm, his movements slow and deliberate. He doesn't shout. He doesn't rely on fear. He doesn't need to. Power radiates from him the way heat rises from asphalt in August. His name is Charles Lucky Luciano, and though he is not yet the legend he will become, everyone in that room knows the truth. This is the man who will redefine everything. Before Luciano, the Mafia in America was a chaotic puzzle, disorganized, tribal, and bound by outdated codes that caused more bloodshed than profit. Old bosses clung stubbornly to traditions that did not survive the ocean crossing from Sicily to New York. Violence erupted over petty disputes. Territory wars dragged on for years. Men died for reasons no one even remembered. It was a system destined to collapse under its own weight. Luciano saw the weakness. He felt the inefficiency. And unlike the men who came before him, he dared to imagine something bigger. On this night, he articulates that vision with a precision that feels almost surgical. He speaks not of revenge, pride, or heritage, but of structure, innovation, and long-term dominance. He outlines his plans to remove the bottlenecks created by tyrannical bosses and to replace the rigid Sicilian hierarchy with a modern approach, one that mirrors the corporate giants rising across America. Crime, to Luciano, is simply another business. And every business needs strategy, cooperation, and a chain of command that serves logic, not ego. As he speaks, the men around him begin to understand the gravity of what is unfolding. They are witnessing the birth of something unprecedented, a unified criminal network that operates with the precision of a multinational organization. Luciano promises not only wealth but stability, not only influence but longevity. He is offering them a future where their power is protected not by violence alone, but by intelligence and coordination. They listen because he is not forcing them, he is convincing them. They follow because he does not demand loyalty, he earns it. Beyond the walls of that room, the city continues its restless dance. Immigrants crowd into tenements, laborers sweat in factories, politicians plot behind polished desks, and prohibition money flows like an underground river. The Great Depression tightens its grip on millions, creating desperation that crime syndicates can exploit. Corrupt officers and hungry politicians look the other way. America is changing and Luciano can feel the shift in the air. He knows this is his moment. The genius of Luciano's approach lies in its duality. On one hand, he embraces the cold pragmatism of business, profits, partnerships, diversification. On the other hand, he retains a deep understanding of the criminal psyche. He knows fear is a powerful motivator, but respect is even stronger. He blends the two with uncanny precision. The aura he carries is not born from brutality alone, but from a rare combination of charm, intelligence, and terrifying resolve. Those who meet him are often surprised by his soft voice and relaxed manner. They expect a monster. Instead, they find a strategist. This contrast, the calm mind within the violent world, becomes the trademark of his leadership. And tonight, in this room filled with dangerous men, that contradiction is what mesmerizes them. Luciano does not promise peace, he promises order. He does not promise mercy, he promises control. And above all, he promises that the era of chaos is over. What none of them know is that this moment will ripple through history. It will reshape the landscape of organized crime not only in America but across continents. It will influence police forces, governments, and intelligence operations for decades. The delicate balance of power Luciano creates will give rise to an empire so efficient, so deeply rooted, that even after his fall, the structure will survive. Some men build nations. Luciano built a shadow nation, one made of silent agreements, coded loyalties, and invisible hierarchies. Tonight marks the turning point, the moment the Mafia transforms from a collection of feuding mobs into a sophisticated machine. And at the center of that transformation stands one man, quietly rearranging the pieces on a board only he can fully see. In this single gathering, with smoke curling toward the ceiling and tension thick enough to taste, Lucky Luciano unveils the hidden playbook that will forever alter the underworld. The men don't yet realize they are witnessing the dawn of a criminal revolution. But history will remember this night as the moment when power changed hands, not through violence but through vision. Before Lucky Luciano ever stepped into the criminal spotlight, America's underworld was a battlefield of confusion, mistrust, and constant eruption. To understand the revolution he engineered, one must first walk through the chaotic maze that existed before him. A world shaped by desperation, cultural friction, and the violent struggle to claim even the smallest corner of power. Early 20th century America was a place where opportunity and danger lived side by side, and the immigrant populations that poured into the country found themselves thrust into a system that pushed many toward survival by any means necessary. Crime was not yet an industry, it was a scattered reaction to poverty, prejudice, and political neglect. In the cramped, unpaved streets of New York's Lower East Side, Little Italy, and the Jewish districts, tension simmered like a pot left on the stove too long. Gangs rose not from ambition but from necessity. Young boys formed alliances based on ethnic lines: Italian, Irish, Jewish, Polish, each group believing they must protect their own or be swallowed by the others. The violence was personal, chaotic, and often senseless. These early gangs fought over petty extortion rackets, gambling tables hidden in basements, and territories marked not by strategy but by emotion. In this environment, a man lived or died by how quickly he could draw a knife, not how cleverly he could negotiate a deal. The Italian Mafia factions that did exist in America were not unified organizations. They were splintered groups, each led by old-world bosses who clung to traditions born in the hills of Sicily. These were men who believed leadership was inherited, not earned. Men who trusted superstition more than logic. They operated as if they were still in small Sicilian villages, not in a rapidly evolving American metropolis. Their codes were rigid, their rules suffocating, and their interpretations of honor often fatal. Disagreement often ended in execution. A misplaced word, a perceived insult, or even rumors whispered by jealous rivals could lead to bloodshed. Across the city, the Irish gangs fought their own battles, often tied to corrupt political machines like Tammany Hall. They controlled police precincts, saloons, and parts of the docks. Meanwhile, Jewish mobsters, driven by sharp intellect and ruthless innovation, began carving out significant influence in gambling and bootlegging. Instead of cooperation, each group fought for dominance. Instead of alliances, they forged temporary, shaky truces that crumbled at the first hint of betrayal. The streets were loud with the sound of fists, gunshots, and broken promises. No one trusted anyone for long. Then came Prohibition in 1920, a government decision that unintentionally poured gasoline on the fire. Alcohol became illegal, but the public still craved it, creating a black market opportunity unlike anything America had seen before. The demand was instant and overwhelming. Smugglers, bootleggers, corrupt cops, and aspiring crime bosses rushed into the trade. But rather than creating a stable hierarchy, Prohibition magnified the chaos. Rival groups hijacked one another's shipments. Political corruption deepened as officials took bribes from whichever gang offered the highest price. Blood spilled on sidewalks, in alleys, in bars, and on the docks where liquor shipments arrived under moonlight. The Mafia in particular faced a deeper problem: its own internal divisions. Two major factions, the Mustache Petes and the younger Americanized Italians, clashed constantly. The Mustache Petes, traditional Sicilian bosses who believed in old customs, rejected any dealings with non-Italians and despised modernization. They refused to adapt to the new environment. They insisted on loyalty to heritage, not to profit. They hoarded power, distrusted innovation, and were convinced that fear alone kept their soldiers in line. But the young generation knew America was different. They knew alliances could strengthen profits, that business could be more lucrative than revenge, and that diversity in partnerships wasn't weakness, it was opportunity. Among these forward-thinking young men stood future names like Meyer, Lansky, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and eventually Lucky Luciano. But before their rise, their ideas were dismissed, their suggestions mocked, and their ambitions stifled. Meanwhile, the government's approach to crime was equally chaotic. Law enforcement agencies were underfunded, uncoordinated, and often corrupt. Many police officers were directly on gang payrolls, turning blind eyes to murders and shipments of illegal alcohol in exchange for weekly envelopes of cash. Judges were bribed. Politicians accepted campaign donations from criminals. Even the newspapers, hungry for sensational headlines, inadvertently glorified gangsters by casting them as modern-day rebels battling a broken system. The public, especially during the Great Depression, developed a strange fascination with outlaws. Many saw them not as villains but as symbols of rebellion in a time when banks were failing, jobs were vanishing, and families starved. Gangsters lived fast, spent lavishly, and defied the same authorities that millions of ordinary citizens had begun to resent. Yet behind the glamorized image lay a brutal reality. Gang wars left innocent bodies in the streets, families destroyed, and neighborhoods locked in a cycle of fear. Territory wars raged across the boroughs. The Castellammarese War, the most infamous mafia conflict of the era, was brewing on the horizon, a bloody clash between powerful Sicilian factions that would leave countless men dead. Leaders like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano ruled with iron fists, crushing dissent and demanding total obedience. They saw America not as a place to innovate but as a battlefield where they would recreate their Sicilian domination. Their refusal to adapt created instability, paranoia, and endless violence. This was the world Luciano would inherit, a world held together by fear, tradition, and fragile alliances. A world where innovation was suffocated, logic overshadowed by pride, and progress blocked by leaders too blinded by old loyalties. America was changing faster than the Mafia could keep up. Industrialization was reshaping the economy, immigration was rewriting the population, and political corruption was becoming more sophisticated. Yet the underworld remained trapped in old patterns, unable to realize that modern crime required modern thinking. In this volatile environment, the stage was set for someone to rise who could see beyond the chaos. Someone who understood both the brutality of survival and the possibilities of strategy. Someone who could bring together scattered factions, forge alliances across cultural lines, and turn violence-driven gangs into a corporate-style criminal network. Before Lucky Luciano ever made his first move, America's underworld was a storm, loud, directionless, and destructive. But storms, while chaotic, also clear the way for new landscapes. And in that clearing, Luciano would build something the world had never seen before. He was born Salvatore Lucania in rural Sicily, a land where poverty was inherited like an unwanted heirloom and danger lived in every shadow of every narrow street. Even as a young boy he saw how power shaped everything, who ate, who starved, who lived, who vanished without a trace. In Sicily, the Mafia wasn't a myth whispered in dark corners, it was a presence felt in the air, like humidity clinging to the skin. It watched over the villages, demanded obedience, and taught young boys the first harsh truth of their lives. The world was ruled not by fairness but by force. But even then, the boy who would become Lucky Luciano was different. He didn't just observe power, he studied it. When Luciano's family boarded a ship to America, they carried the same hopes as millions of immigrants who crossed the ocean believing they were stepping toward a better life. But when they arrived in New York, the American dream did not greet them with open arms. Instead, they found themselves swallowed by the unforgiving tenements of the Lower East Side, where overcrowded buildings leaned against one another like exhausted giants, and the stench of garbage, sweat, and desperation filled the air. The streets were alive with noise, vendors shouting in broken English, children playing barefoot on cracked sidewalks, men arguing in the languages of half a dozen countries. It was a melting pot, but the melting was never gentle. It burned, scarred, and shaped everyone who lived there. Young Salvatore, barely able to speak English, was thrust into a world where survival became a daily negotiation. School was a luxury he couldn't afford for long. Bullies, rival ethnic groups, and street hustlers made the neighborhood a battlefield. But instead of shrinking from danger, he adapted. He learned quickly that strength alone wasn't enough. You needed confidence, presence, and the ability to read a person's intentions before they spoke. He learned which corners the Irish gangs controlled, where the Jewish boys hung out, and which alleyways were safe shortcuts home. He memorized faces, voices, and the subtle signals of threat. He was becoming not just a survivor but a strategist. By the age of 10 he was already earning pennies doing small errands for older street kids, acting as a lookout, delivering messages, running packages whose contents he didn't dare question. It wasn't long before he joined a neighborhood crew, not because he loved crime but because he understood something crucial. Without a group, you were prey. The street didn't care about your dreams, your family, or your innocence. It cared only about whether you had the numbers and the nerve to defend yourself. One pivotal moment arrived when a group of Irish boys cornered him and demanded the small coins he had earned selling newspapers. Instead of handing them over or backing down, young Luciano made a choice that would define his future. He fought. The beating he took was harsh, but he didn't run. He stood his ground, facing boys bigger and stronger than him with a ferocity they didn't expect. When the fight ended, he lay bruised on the street, but he had earned something far more valuable than money: reputation. The neighborhood kids began to see him not as just another immigrant boy, but as someone who couldn't be intimidated. That spark of defiance grew with him. His Sicilian roots had taught him silence. America taught him ambition. A boy who might have become just another laborer in Sicily discovered a new identity on these rough streets. A leader in the making. As adolescence approached, he befriended other ambitious street kids, including future legends like Meyer, Lansky, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. With Lansky he found someone who matched his intelligence. With Siegel he found a partner unafraid of violence. Together they formed a trio that would shake the foundation of organized crime in the years ahead. By his early teens, Luciano was running his own small-time rackets. Cigarettes, protection money, dice games, nothing too big, nothing too risky, but everything productive. He didn't just force people to pay, he convinced them. Protection became not a threat, but a service. The seeds of his future style were visible even then. He preferred cooperation to chaos, negotiation to unnecessary bloodshed. He recruited teenagers the same way a young CEO recruits employees, promising profit, loyalty, and opportunity. He wasn't the most violent kid, nor the strongest, but he was the one everyone trusted to make the smartest decision. At home, his parents barely recognized the dual life he was living. To them, he was still Salvatore, the quiet son who helped with chores and tried to stay out of trouble. But outside he was evolving into someone far more formidable. The streets shaped him, the poverty sharpened him, and the endless ethnic rivalries taught him how to maneuver between worlds. He learned English not from schoolbooks but from the tough kids on street corners, from gamblers, hustlers, and petty criminals. He picked up slang, swagger, and the ability to charm or threaten depending on what the situation demanded. As the years passed, Luciano realized two things with absolute clarity. First, crime wasn't a temporary escape from poverty, it could be a path to power. Second, the chaos around him was inefficient. The gangs were disorganized, the leaders driven by emotion, and the opportunities wasted by foolish decisions. Even as a teenager he began to see the cracks in the system. He imagined something bigger, something structured, profitable, and controlled. But vision alone wasn't enough. Luciano needed experience, connections, and a deep understanding of how the underworld truly worked. He began to observe the older, more established criminals. He watched how disputes were handled, how deals were negotiated, how loyalty was rewarded and betrayal punished. He studied the Italian Mafia factions and understood their strengths and weaknesses. He learned from Jewish gangsters how money could buy influence in ways fear never could. He saw how the Irish used politics to protect themselves. Piece by piece, he was collecting insights that would later form the foundation of a criminal empire unlike anything America had seen. It was during this period that Salvatore Lucania shed his birth name and became Lucky. The origins of the nickname would be debated for decades. Some said it came from surviving a brutal kidnapping and beating, others claimed it was sarcasm, born from his ability to escape the consequences of his crimes. But the truth didn't matter. What mattered was that the name stuck, and with it came a persona that enhanced his growing presence. Lucky Luciano was a name people remembered, a name that traveled through the streets with weight. By the time he reached his early 20s, Luciano was no longer a boy from the tenements, he was a force. A rising figure who had absorbed the lessons of poverty, discrimination, and street warfare and transformed them into something sharp, strategic, and unstoppable. He wasn't just preparing to enter the world of organized crime. He was preparing to reshape it. The streets of New York were more than just a backdrop for Lucky Luciano's rise. They were his university, his training ground, and his battleground. Every alley, every storefront, every dimly lit bar taught him a lesson about survival and ambition. By the time he was a young man, Luciano understood that power wasn't something you waited for. It was something you recognized, seized, and shaped with your own hands. And the crucible that sharpened him into the man he would become was the 5 Points Gang, one of the most infamous and feared criminal organizations in the country. The 5 Points was unlike the small neighborhood crews Luciano had grown up around. It was a violent collective of hardened criminals, professional thieves, brawlers, and budding mobsters. These were men who didn't hide their brutality, they wore it like armor. The gang operated gambling dens, controlled brothels and enforced protection rackets across Lower Manhattan. Joining meant entering a world where loyalty was conditional and betrayal was a death sentence. But for Luciano, it was the opportunity he'd been preparing for all his life. His entry wasn't dramatic. There was no grand initiation or announcement. He simply proved himself. He did the jobs others hesitated to do. He collected debts from men who threatened violence. He delivered packages with the silence and efficiency of a shadow. He enforced protection payments with a balance of intimidation and charm that set him apart. What made Luciano valuable wasn't just his willingness to work, it was how he thought. Even older gang members noticed that he didn't fight recklessly or act impulsively. He calculated. He analyzed. He treated every situation like a puzzle that had a best possible solution. With each job, he earned the respect of figures who would shape his early criminal education. Men like Paul Kelly, the 5 points elegant, calculating leader, took note of Luciano's potential. Kelly was unlike the street brawlers Luciano had known. He dressed like a businessman, spoke multiple languages and understood politics better than most politicians. He saw crime not as chaos but as opportunity. And under his influence, Luciano discovered the true difference between a gangster and a strategist. Kelly introduced him to powerful people, politicians, union heads, corrupt police officers. These meetings took place in polished restaurants, backstage at theaters, or in the backrooms of high-end clubs where criminals and city leaders mingled more openly than the public suspected. Luciano learned how bribes were negotiated, how favors were exchanged, how influence spread through the city like an invisible river. He realized that violence could dominate a block, but money and connections could dominate an entire city. At the same time, Luciano was learning the darker lessons of the streets. He saw how deals turned sour, how alliances shattered, how one wrong word could end a life. He watched men who were powerful one day and dead the next. He witnessed betrayals carried out by supposed friends. All of these experiences hardened him, not in a way that made him cruel, but in a way that made him perceptive. He understood that in the world he was entering, emotions were liabilities and hesitation was fatal. One of the most defining moments of his apprenticeship came through an unexpected alliance with another rising figure, Frank Costello. Costello was calm, diplomatic, and had a unique talent for negotiating with both criminals and politicians. Luciano recognized immediately that Costello possessed something rare, a mind built for business, not brutality. Together they began to experiment with new methods of operating. They expanded rackets beyond traditional Italian neighborhoods, forging cross-ethnic partnerships that older mafia figures considered taboo. To them, profit mattered more than outdated rules. Then came his relationship with Meyer Lansky, the boyhood friend who would become his lifelong partner in building a criminal empire. Lansky's brilliance lay in mathematics, strategy, and the ability to see patterns in chaos. He treated illegal rackets the way an accountant treated ledgers, calculating risk and reward with icy precision. Luciano and Lansky shared a vision. Crime could be professional, organized, efficient, predictable. A business. This trio, Luciano, Costello, and Lansky, formed a nucleus of innovation that would eventually reshape the entire mafia structure. But back then, during Luciano's early years in the 5 Points gang, they were simply ambitious young men trying to rise above the noise. As the opportunities around him grew, so did the dangers. Organized crime was entering a transformative era because of prohibition. The country's sudden thirst for black market alcohol created enormous profits, and equally enormous conflicts. Luciano dove headfirst into bootlegging operations, learning the complexities of smuggling, distribution, and bribery networks. He saw how trucks needed safe routes, how warehouse guards needed paying off, how senators could be influenced with the right donation. The scale of the illegal liquor business dwarfed anything he had ever imagined. He took risks. He dealt with men far more violent than anyone he'd met in his youth. He forged partnerships with Jewish and Irish gangs at a time when such collaborations could make him an enemy in his own community. But every risk was calculated. Every move had a purpose. Of course, no rise is without danger. Luciano's growing influence attracted jealousy, and rival criminals saw him as a threat. One night in 1929, after a dispute with unknown assailants, he was kidnapped, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on a Staten Island beach. Many thought it was the end of him. But Luciano survived. How he lived remained a mystery, adding to the legend that he was lucky, though he always dismissed the nickname as exaggeration. But the attack changed him. Lying in a hospital bed, his face swollen beyond recognition, he realized something darkly profound. Survival was no longer enough. To truly rise he would need control. When he returned to the streets, something in him had sharpened. The near-death experience stripped away any lingering hesitation and solidified his belief that the old ways were not just inefficient, they were deadly. He began quietly evaluating the power structures within the Mafia, identifying weaknesses, and imagining a future where violence was the last resort, not the first. His time with the 5 Points gang had taught him how the streets worked. Now he was thinking like a man who wanted to run them. Every lesson, every betrayal witnessed, every alliance built, every dollar earned, became a brick in the foundation of the empire he would one day create. Luciano was no longer simply learning crime. He was studying leadership, influence, economics, psychology, and strategy. And soon he would put all of it to use in ways that no one around him could yet imagine. The Mafia Luciano inherited was built on traditions older than America itself, forged in the hills of Sicily where silence meant survival and loyalty was a matter of life and death. The Code of Omerta, the sacred rule that demanded secrecy above all else, shaped every member's identity from the smallest street soldier to the most feared don. But as Lucky Luciano rose higher in the criminal world, he began to see what others refused to admit. The old codes were beginning to crack. They were powerful, yes, but rigid, outdated, and dangerously inflexible in a country changing faster than any Sicilian law ever had. If he wanted to build a new empire, he would need to rewrite what had been treated as unchangeable gospel. To understand why his revolution mattered, one must first understand the world that tried to contain him. Omerta was more than silence, it was obedience. It demanded that men accept decisions without question, even if those decisions put them, or their families, in danger. It required absolute loyalty to a boss, even when that boss was foolish, reckless, or blinded by pride. It insisted that disputes be handled through violence, not negotiation. Honor, as defined by the Old World Mafia, often meant bloodshed for reasons that made little sense outside Sicilian villages where grudges were as ancient as the stones beneath them. But this wasn't Sicily. This was New York City, a living, breathing beast of steel, opportunity, and relentless evolution. Luciano saw that America didn't play by the same rules, and those who refused to adapt would get crushed beneath the wheels of progress. He had seen too many old-world bosses cling to pride while the world passed them by. He had watched ethnic boundaries limit potential alliances. He had witnessed disputes escalate into wars that cost money and lives for nothing more than the bruised ego of a stubborn leader. He realized one harsh truth: the Code of Omerta protected the bosses more than it protected the business. Where others saw tradition, Luciano saw inefficiency. Where others saw loyalty, he saw fear disguised as devotion. And where others worshipped the past, he dissected it, searching for the parts worth keeping and discarding the rest like broken tools. His first challenge was subtle. He had to understand the psychology of the men bound by these old rules. They didn't follow the code because it worked, they followed it because they believed it gave them identity. They feared change more than death. Some had crossed oceans to escape poverty and oppression, only to cling to the very culture that had limited them in the first place. These men respected hierarchy, ritual, and the illusion of honor more than profits or stability. Luciano needed them to see that a new world demanded a new kind of loyalty. So he began quietly redefining the meaning of loyalty itself. In his view, loyalty should not be blind, it should be earned. A leader's authority should come from competence, not age or heritage. Respect should come from results, not from stories of ancestors who fought in forgotten Sicilian feuds. Luciano didn't preach this openly. Open rebellion was suicide, but he lived it. He demonstrated it in the way he treated his allies. He listened to them. He negotiated with them. He valued their skills regardless of their ethnicity. These small acts were radical in a world where rank was supposed to be absolute. This new perspective terrified the mustache Petes, the traditional Sicilian bosses who saw Luciano as a threat to everything they held sacred. They saw him forming alliances with Jews and Irishmen, something they considered unthinkable, even dishonorable. They saw him questioning decisions and seeking efficiency instead of blind obedience. They saw him putting business above pride. To them, he was a rebel wearing the suit of a gentleman but carrying the mind of a revolutionary. Luciano knew that challenging the old guard would require more than persuasive words. He had to build a new culture strong enough to replace the old one. His first step was convincing his closest allies, Costello, Lansky, Genovese, Siegel, that money could make men loyal in ways fear never could. Violence ensured compliance, but profits created commitment. If everyone benefited from the success of the organization, the structure would maintain itself. Greed, not honor, became the glue holding alliances together. It was a simple truth: but one that traditional bosses ignored at their peril. In the shadows of backrooms and during quiet meetings over drinks, Luciano crafted a new unspoken code, one that valued intelligence, negotiation, and calculated risk. He taught his circle that anger was a weakness and revenge was a distraction. "A dead man can't make you money," he once said, a line that echoed through the underworld like prophecy. These words weren't just philosophy, they were strategy. The Mafia had been wasting potential on feuds and vendettas that produced nothing but corpses. Luciano envisioned an organization that operated like a corporation, where disputes were resolved through discussion, agreements were written like business contracts, and violence was a last resort used only when it protected profits. But to rewrite the code, he needed to break its enforcers. The decisive moment came during the Castellamarese conflict, a brutal war between Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, two relics of the old world whose stubborn adherence to Sicilian tradition had plunged the underworld into chaos. Luciano was caught between them, forced to choose between loyalty and logic. He chose neither. Instead, he chose the future. He orchestrated the removal of both bosses, quietly, efficiently, and with precision that shocked even his allies. In doing so, he shattered the foundation of the old order. No one had ever dared to eliminate the top figures of the Mafia without fearing total annihilation. But Luciano did it with a calm conviction that made even the most hardened killers realize something monumental had happened. The old rules weren't unbreakable. The old hierarchy wasn't untouchable. The old code wasn't sacred. With the old bosses gone, Luciano stepped into the vacuum, not as a dictator but as a reformer. He presented his new vision, a syndicate built on cooperation, profit, and shared power. The commission, the governing body he would soon create, was the physical embodiment of his rewritten code. It replaced blind obedience with structured leadership. It replaced emotional feuds with logical discourse. It replaced the old-world tyranny with a modern system that valued intelligence over tradition. The transformation was not instant. Some men resisted, clinging to the familiar comfort of their rigid code. But over time, Luciano's results spoke louder than any Sicilian oath. Money flowed, violence decreased, and businesses prospered. Loyalty shifted naturally toward the man who delivered success. In the end, Luciano did what no Mafia boss before him had dared to do. He turned Omerta from a prison into a tool, from an outdated commandment into a flexible strategy. He didn't destroy the code, he repurposed it. And in doing so, he built the ideological foundation of the modern American Mafia. The underworld of New York was still trembling from the shockwaves of the Castellamarese War when Lucky Luciano began quietly laying the blueprint for something revolutionary. The old bosses were gone, the old loyalties shattered, and the streets were thick with uncertainty. This was the moment where most men would consolidate power, crown themselves king, and rule with an iron fist. But Luciano was not most men. He didn't want a throne. He wanted a system, a machine that would run smoothly long after he was gone, a structure that would turn chaos into opportunity and ambition into order. He understood something the old-world bosses never did. Power concentrated in one man was fragile. All it took was a bullet, a betrayal, or a shift in alliances, and the entire empire collapsed. The Mafia as it existed before him was a house resting on one pillar. Remove the pillar and everything came crashing down. Luciano envisioned a new kind of architecture, one with multiple pillars, each supporting the others, ensuring stability through shared power rather than dictatorial rule. It was an idea born not from tradition but from observation, of corporations, of political machines, of armies that thrived on structure, delegation, and clarity. In the weeks following Maranzano's assassination, Luciano began meeting with key figures from every major Italian-American crime family. These gatherings were intimate, quiet, and calculated. Men who had once eyed each other with suspicion now sat across from one another, listening as Luciano painted a picture of what the future could look like. He spoke with calm confidence, explaining that the Mafia could no longer afford to act like warring tribes. The world was evolving too quickly. Prohibition profits were enormous, but the violence surrounding them had attracted too much government attention. The chaos was no longer sustainable. If they wanted lasting influence and generational wealth, they needed order, cooperation, and a framework that prevented conflicts before they erupted. What he proposed was unprecedented: a national board of directors for the Mafia. A governing council where each major crime family had a voice. No single man would rule uncontested. Instead, decisions would be made collectively, disputes settled diplomatically, and territories respected like business districts. It was a radical departure from centuries of Sicilian hierarchy. The idea of sharing power was nearly unthinkable, but Luciano spoke with an authority that made even the most skeptical bosses pause. He promised fairness, stability, and prosperity. He promised that no boss would have to live in constant fear of another war. He promised peace but not weakness, efficiency but not submission. And so the commission was born. It began with 5 families in New York, the Luciano, Bonanno, Professai, Mangano, and Gagliano families, each granted autonomy in their territories, each responsible for running their operations like independent companies, but all bound by shared interests. Over time, other major cities across America were integrated: Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, Cleveland, Philadelphia. The commission became the unseen Congress of organized crime, operating in the shadows with more discipline than many legitimate governments. Luciano established clear principles to guide this new structure. First, no boss was above the commission. Not even him. If a conflict arose, the commission decided the outcome, not tradition, not pride, not brute force. Second, the Mafia would open its doors to strategic alliances beyond Italy. Luciano had long believed that profit should never be restricted by ethnicity. Jewish mobsters like Meyer, Lansky, Dutch Schultz, and Bugsy Siegel had proven invaluable during Prohibition. Irish syndicates controlled political connections. Luciano insisted that collaboration, not exclusion, was the key to modern criminal success. Third, violence would be used as a last resort. The days of senseless street wars were over. Violence attracted headlines, headlines attracted cops, and cops disrupted business. Luciano favored intelligence over intimidation, agreements over assassinations. This new era demanded organization, and Luciano excelled at it. He divided responsibilities among trusted lieutenants who each specialized in different enterprises. Frank Costello handled political bribery and union infiltration. Vito Genovese managed drug distribution and international connections. Joe Adonis oversaw gambling operations. Lansky handled finances with the precision of a Wall Street banker. Each man became a pillar of the system, responsible for maintaining order in their domain. Luciano himself became the architect and quiet overseer. He didn't micromanage, he guided. He didn't rule through fear. He ruled through respect and undeniable effectiveness. Men followed him because he made them richer than they had ever imagined and safer than they had ever felt. Under his leadership, the Mafia shifted from an emotional, pride-driven institution to a rational, profit-driven enterprise. With the structure in place, Luciano broadened his vision. He wanted the Mafia to function like a modern corporation, a diversified, interconnected conglomerate with operations in multiple sectors. The commission allowed him to streamline rackets across territories, eliminating overlap and competition. Instead of rival families battling for control of gambling dens and speakeasies, they coordinated efforts, shared resources, and expanded markets. The Mafia began exerting influence over labor unions, using strikes and intimidation to control industries like construction, shipping, and trucking. These unions became powerful leverage points, tools for extortion, negotiation, and political influence. Through his blueprint, the Mafia also gained an unexpected advantage: invisibility. A decentralized structure meant that no single leader was easily identifiable as the head of the entire organization. Law enforcement, confused and overwhelmed, often failed to understand how interconnected the operations were. They were fighting a smoke cloud, a shadow network that left few fingerprints. Luciano understood that secrecy wasn't about silence, it was about complexity. He even applied corporate logic to succession planning. Each family had a clear hierarchy, ensuring smooth transitions of leadership in the event of imprisonment or death. There would be no more power vacuums, no more unpredictable wars triggered by a boss's downfall. The machine would keep running even if one part malfunctioned. The commission meetings were held discreetly in hotels, restaurants, or private homes, always under heavy security. The bosses discussed territories, disputes, expansions, and political strategies. They talked about how to influence elections, how to secure contracts for major construction projects, how to negotiate with rival criminal networks. These meetings were calm, almost businesslike. No shouting, no threats. Disagreements were addressed logically. Votes were taken when necessary. It was the American Mafia's boardroom, a silent, invisible government operating within the margins of society. Yet for all the order Luciano created, he understood that any system, no matter how elegant, was only as strong as the men running it. He chose his allies carefully, rewarding competence and eliminating liability. Those who resisted the new order found themselves isolated or quietly removed. The commission wasn't a democracy, it was a controlled ecosystem, shaped by Luciano's vision and protected by his strategic ruthlessness. His blueprint worked with astonishing speed. Profits soared. Arrests decreased. Violence dropped. Casinos, nightclubs, bootlegging operations, extortion schemes, all began functioning with unprecedented efficiency. The Mafia transformed from a loose confederation of violent street gangs into a national powerhouse that influenced everything from local politics to international smuggling routes. What Luciano created was more than a criminal organization. It was a system, a structure so brilliant that it survived long after he lost direct control of it. The Commission outlived him, outlived many of the men he built it with, and became the backbone of organized crime for generations. And it all began not with a gunshot or a coup, but with the radical, daring idea that crime could be organized, not through fear but through structure. Not through tradition but through strategy. The hidden blueprint he crafted became the DNA of the modern Mafia, a silent architecture that shaped the underworld like a blueprint shapes a skyscraper. Once Luciano's blueprint was set in motion, the underworld began to operate with a kind of rhythm it had never known before. Profits flowed steadily, alliances held firm, and violence simmered quietly beneath the surface instead of erupting across neighborhoods. But no empire, criminal or legitimate, can thrive without navigating the delicate balance between trusted allies and dangerous enemies. And for Lucky Luciano, these relationships became both the lifeblood of his success and the minefield he walked across every day of his ascent. To understand the Mafia Luciano built, you must first understand the men who helped him build it. They were not loyal because of tradition. They were loyal because they saw in Luciano something rare, someone who understood them, valued their strengths, and offered them a future bigger than anything they could create alone. His closest allies formed a circle of influence that blended intellect, ruthlessness, and ambition into a powerful force. Meyer Lansky was the brain behind the numbers, the man with a quiet voice but an ironclad sense of strategy. He had no interest in theatrics, no desire for fame. What he wanted was control of finances, of odds, of systems. When Luciano looked at Lansky, he didn't see a Jewish outsider. He saw a partner whose talents could expand the Mafia's reach beyond any ethnic limitations. Lansky's ability to calculate risk and return made him indispensable. It was Lansky who strengthened their hold on illegal gambling, introduced modern accounting into their operations, and later helped orchestrate some of the most profitable casinos in America and Cuba. Where Luciano built the structure, Lansky ensured it never collapsed under its own weight. Then there was Frank Costello, smooth-talking and politically connected, a man who could walk into the office of a corrupt politician and walk out with a favor worth more than any weapon. Costello understood influence better than most senators did. His tongue was sharper than his gun, and he used it to carve pathways into unions, political machines, and city institutions. To Costello, power wasn't about bullets, it was about being untouchable, protected by the very system that claimed to oppose men like him. Luciano valued him for that. In a world where criminals often relied on violence, Costello showed that subtlety could be far more dangerous. And then there was Bugsy Siegel, the fire to Luciano's ice. Siegel was unpredictable, charming, reckless, an uncontrollable flame that burned whoever stood too close. Yet he had an energy, a daring drive that Luciano found useful. Siegel didn't fear danger, he ran toward it. He was the perfect instrument for operations that needed aggression, charisma, or both. While Lansky brought the numbers and Costello the finesse, Siegel brought the raw force that kept competitors terrified. Together, these men formed a constellation around Luciano, a network of skills that complemented his strategic brilliance. But every powerful alliance cast a shadow, and in those shadows lurked enemies who resented Luciano's rise. Some hated him for challenging tradition. Others feared his influence. Many envied his success. Dutch Schultz was one of the most volatile of these enemies. Schultz was a man of impulse, driven by greed and paranoia. He resented Luciano's calm control and despised the idea of sharing territory or profits. Schultz wanted absolute domination of the bootlegging business, especially in Harlem, and he didn't hesitate to use violence to get it. His brutality was legendary, his temper unpredictable. Luciano viewed him as a liability, not just to himself but to the entire underworld. And when Schultz proposed assassinating prosecutor Thomas Dewey, Luciano opposed it fiercely. Killing a law enforcement official of that stature would unleash a storm no criminal could survive. Schultz didn't care. He wanted Dewey dead. Luciano made a decision that defined his leadership. He couldn't allow one man's foolishness to destroy the system he was building. The commission agreed. Schultz was eliminated, not out of revenge but out of necessity. It was a calculated strike to preserve order. This moment marked the shift from the old Mafia's emotional violence to Luciano's strategic ruthlessness. He didn't kill enemies for pride. He removed obstacles. Inside the Italian families, another threat simmered. Men who believed that Luciano's willingness to partner with Jews and Irishmen was sacrilege. Some whispered that he was betraying his heritage. Others accused him of being too modern, too ambitious. Among these critics were traditionalists who still wished to resurrect the old hierarchies. Luciano handled them the same way a chess master handles pawns. He watched, waited, and moved only when the board demanded it. One of the most treacherous figures he had to navigate was Vito Genovese, an ambitious, cunning man who pretended to be Luciano's ally but secretly envied his power. Genovese admired Luciano's empire but hated that he wasn't the one ruling it. He was loyal when loyalty benefited him and ruthless when betrayal offered a better reward. Luciano recognized the danger but kept Genovese close, the way a general keeps a potential traitor within eyesight. To Luciano, managing enemies wasn't always about eliminating them, it was about understanding their motives and using their ambitions as levers. Outside the Italian circles, Luciano forged alliances with a wide array of criminal groups. He had the foresight to understand that cooperation expanded markets and minimized conflict. With Lansky's help, he formed the National Crime Syndicate, a loose but influential network uniting Jewish, Irish, Italian, and even black gangsters across the country. This gave the Mafia unprecedented reach, from New York to Chicago, from Miami to Los Angeles. It ensured that the criminal underworld became interconnected, mutually beneficial, and far more powerful than it had ever been under isolated tribal leadership. But allies had to be managed just as carefully as enemies. Luciano became a master of balancing these relationships. He rewarded loyalty generously, money, territory, protection, but he also punished disloyalty swiftly. His leadership depended on maintaining a delicate equilibrium: fear without tyranny, influence without dictatorship. He listened more than he spoke. He observed more than he acted. And because he understood human nature so deeply, he could predict betrayals before they happened. He once said, "A man's eyes tell you what his words hide." That philosophy guided his interactions with friends and rivals alike. He memorized mannerisms, caught subtle shifts in tone, noticed when a man was too eager or too quiet. He played the long game, manipulating alliances like a weaver threading a loom. Each connection strengthened the tapestry of his empire. Each eliminated threat tightened its integrity. As the years went on, Luciano's network became not just a criminal alliance, but a political ecosystem. Judges were influenced, police precincts compromised, labor unions infiltrated. Thanks to Costello, local politicians listened when Luciano spoke. Thanks to Lansky, financial operations were nearly impossible to trace. Thanks to Siegel and others like him, rivals remained intimidated or silent. This delicate balance of allies and enemies allowed Luciano to rise to a level of power no mafia leader before him had ever achieved. But it also created the framework for the challenges he would soon face, from law enforcement, from betrayals, and eventually from within his own circle. The empire he built required constant negotiation, constant vigilance. And in the underworld, even the strongest alliances were written in smoke, beautiful, powerful, and always at risk of disappearing into the air. The empire Luciano built did not exist in a vacuum. It existed under constant threat, from rival criminals, from internal politics, and most dangerously from the growing arm of American law enforcement. To Luciano, these threats were not enemies to be defeated in open war. They were storms to be navigated, shadows to be outmaneuvered, and institutions to be manipulated from within. What unfolded during these years was a hidden war, one fought not on the streets but behind doors, in whispered conversations, in coded messages, and in the silent tension between power and survival. By the early 1930s, the criminal landscape had changed. The chaos of prohibition had given birth to a sophisticated underworld with national networks, international contacts, and unprecedented influence. Yet every rise attracted attention. Newspapers sensationalized gangland murders. Politicians demanded action. Public outrage grew with every headline about bootlegging rings, gambling dens, and assassinations. For the first time, law enforcement agencies across states began working together. Prosecutors saw organized crime not just as a local menace, but as a national threat, and many of them built their careers on the promise of bringing down the men behind it, especially the elusive Luciano. The most formidable of these new adversaries was a young, relentless prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey. Clean-cut, ambitious, and determined to make his mark, Dewey saw the Mafia as a hydra, a creature whose heads needed cutting off regardless of the cost. He had little interest in the local thugs and street-level operators. He wanted the architects, the strategists, the men at the top. And no name loomed larger in the shadowy underworld than Lucky Luciano. Luciano watched Dewey's rise with a cold, calculating eye. He knew the man's type: moral crusaders who believed justice could conquer corruption. In a different world, Luciano might have admired Dewey's tenacity. But in the world they shared, the prosecutor became a threat that required constant attention. Luciano didn't underestimate him. He observed him the way a general studies an enemy commander, learning his tactics, his motivations, his weaknesses. Dewey was incorruptible, unaffected by bribes, immune to intimidation. That made him dangerous. But it also made him predictable. As Dewey's investigations intensified, Luciano adapted. His operations became more discreet. Meetings moved further underground. Communication relied on trusted intermediaries and coded systems. The commission enforced strict guidelines: no unnecessary violence, no public displays of power, no sloppy mistakes. Yet even the most disciplined organization leaves traces, and Dewey knew how to follow them. Luciano understood that survival depended on two things: silence and misdirection. Silence meant loyalty. Misdirection meant confusion. He used both like weapons. When Dewey targeted gambling operations, Luciano shifted resources to union rackets. When police raided speakeasies, he established hidden distilleries in towns no one had heard of. When wiretaps threatened the flow of information, he changed every protocol. The underworld became a ghost network, always moving, always adapting, always one step ahead. But the hidden war wasn't only fought in the shadows of law enforcement. It simmered within the Mafia itself. Every large organization faces internal tension, and the commission was no exception. Men with ambition watched the pressure from law enforcement and wondered if the empire was still invincible. Some believed Luciano's modern reforms had brought too much attention. Others feared that outside alliances weakened their heritage. These murmurs of doubt grew louder as Dewey's reputation soared. 10 years earlier, such unrest would have triggered a violent purge. But Luciano handled dissent with the finesse of a diplomat. He met privately with family leaders, reassuring them, reminding them of their profits, their stability, their rising power. He painted Dewey's campaign as temporary, the kind of storm the commission was built to withstand. His calmness, his ability to frame danger as opportunity, kept the machine running even when anxiety seeped through its cracks. Still, there were moments when diplomacy wasn't enough. There were informants to identify, traitors to silence, competitors to neutralize. Yet Luciano insisted that every action must have purpose. No random killings. No emotional decisions. Violence was a scalpel, not a hammer. And every cut had to be clean. Dewey's investigations pushed harder. Raids increased. Nightclubs were shut down. Brothels, gambling rings, and bootlegging routes were dismantled. The hidden war grew more intense. The press adored Dewey, labeling him a hero. Politicians backed him. Crowds gathered outside courthouses cheering his victories. And behind those headlines, behind the public spectacle, Luciano worked tirelessly to stay invisible. He expanded networks outside New York, into Louisiana, Florida, New Jersey, and Cuba. He fostered deeper ties with international smugglers. He strengthened alliances with Jewish and Irish groups who operated outside the Italian spotlight. Each expansion made the Mafia harder to dismantle. If Dewey cut one head of the operation, two more sprouted elsewhere. It wasn't arrogance, it was strategy. Luciano built redundancy into the system. From the outside it looked like chaos. From the inside it was brilliance. Yet for all his foresight, Luciano could not stop the tide forever. The hidden war was wearing on him. The pressure grew. His movements became restricted. Trusted associates were trailed. Informants were turned. Even the commission began tightening its structure, preparing for the possibility that their leader might be targeted. Luciano was still powerful, still respected, but he felt the walls inching closer. He didn't panic. He didn't lash out. Instead, he observed. He waited. He adjusted. The war with law enforcement was not one he could win outright. Not when the enemy played by rules that granted them public sympathy and political power. But he could delay them. He could mislead them. He could build a system so vast and so complex that even his absence wouldn't collapse it. And that became his ultimate focus. The hidden war wasn't about defeating Dewey. It wasn't about preserving his own freedom. It was about ensuring the empire would outlive him. Every strategic move he made in these years, reducing violence, expanding territories, decentralizing operations, was done with that purpose in mind. He understood something simple and profound. A king can be dethroned. A system cannot. And so while Dewey believed he was chasing a man, Luciano was constructing a legacy, one that would continue long after the prosecutor declared victory. The hidden war shaped both their destinies. Dewey would become a national hero. Luciano would become a myth. And in that quiet, relentless battle between law and crime, between structure and ambition, between the hunter and the architect, the future of the American Mafia was forged. The fall of a powerful man never begins with a single moment. It begins with tiny fractures, small signs that the world is shifting beneath his feet, subtle warnings that go unnoticed until they become impossible to ignore. For Lucky Luciano, the beginning of his downfall did not arrive with handcuffs or courtroom accusations. It began with whispers in alleyways, undercover reports, political ambitions, and the slow tightening of a noose woven by a man who had made it his mission to destroy the empire Luciano built. The hidden war that had simmered for years was now evolving into something more direct, more dangerous, and far more personal. The pressure started building quietly. One brothel was raided. Then another. Arrests that once meant nothing suddenly turned into interrogations. Street operators who had previously endured jail time without complaint now faced prosecutors armed with something new: fear. Not fear of gang retribution, but fear of long prison sentences, ruined families, and public humiliation. Dewey's strategy was psychological. If he couldn't touch the top, he would break the bottom until someone cracked. Luciano could feel it. He sensed a shift in the air, the way an experienced sailor senses a storm long before clouds form. Reports came in from lieutenants that cops were asking sharper questions, that certain operations felt watched, that some low-level workers were growing nervous. It was nothing concrete, just subtle patterns repeated enough to become unsettling. Luciano's mind worked like a chessboard, always scanning, always anticipating. And for the first time in years, he felt the uncomfortable awareness of an opponent who refused to play by the predictable rules of the underworld. The trigger came from the most unexpected place: the prostitution racket. Of all the Mafia's activities, prostitution was one Luciano cared the least about. It was messy, unpredictable, and rife with informants. He preferred operations that ran cleanly: gambling, union influence, controlled smuggling. But the prostitution syndicates in New York were vast, involving hundreds of women and dozens of madams and pimps who operated under the Mafia's protection. Luciano didn't manage it directly. He entrusted others to maintain the system. But that distance would not save him. In fact, it would become the very weapon used against him. Dewey's investigators began targeting brothel workers, not with threats of violence but with promises of freedom. Many of these women had endured years of abuse, addiction, and exploitation. To them, the Mafia was not a glamorous empire. It was a cage. Dewey offered a key. Slowly, painfully, the testimonies trickled in, stories shaped by fear, desperation, and sometimes exaggeration. Dewey didn't care. He needed a narrative, and the media loved stories of vice, corruption, and innocent women trapped by cruel gangsters. Newspapers printed sensational headlines calling Luciano the king of the brothels, a title Luciano found both ridiculous and infuriating. But public opinion was shifting, and that shift carried political weight. Luciano's associates urged him to lay low. Others suggested eliminating key witnesses. But Luciano knew better. Violence would only prove Dewey's accusations right. He needed a different kind of approach. He tightened operations, reduced his public presence, and held fewer meetings. Yet even as he moved with caution, the walls continued to close in. Dewey had momentum, and momentum is a powerful enemy. One of the most damaging blows came from inside Luciano's own circle. A man named Charles Lucky Luciano had too many enemies, and some of them were willing to talk. Rival factions saw Dewey's campaign as a chance to weaken Luciano's power. Men who had once benefited from his leadership now whispered to prosecutors, offering minor details in hopes of gaining favor or avoiding charges. The commission remained supportive, but cracks appeared around the edges. No empire, no matter how well structured, is immune to self-preservation instincts. Meanwhile, Dewey built his case with theatrical precision. He gathered testimonies. He staged dramatic raids. He spoke at rallies about cleansing New York of corruption. His name began to circulate in political circles as a rising star. Bringing down Luciano would not just be a legal triumph, it would be a launchpad for a brilliant career. Dewey understood the stakes. He knew that the public loved heroes and loved to watch powerful criminals fall even more. Luciano watched all of this unfold with a calm exterior, but inside he felt a tightening coil of frustration. He was being accused of crimes he didn't personally commit, by people who had never even met him. This wasn't about justice, it was about ambition. But knowing that didn't change the danger. Then came the night that changed everything. Luciano was in Hot Springs, Arkansas, a place he frequented for rest, gambling and relative anonymity. It was supposed to be a safe distance from the legal storm gathering around him. But Dewey had grown tired of chasing him from city to city. In cooperation with local authorities, he ordered an aggressive move. Luciano was arrested while relaxing in his hotel suite. No warning. No negotiation. No room for escape. The moment the handcuffs clicked, Luciano understood that the game had changed. This was no longer the hidden war. This was open confrontation. Officers transported him like a prized trophy, delivering him into Dewey's jurisdiction, where the headlines were already waiting. Crowds gathered to watch the infamous mob boss brought low. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Luciano remained calm, his face unreadable, but inside, a dozen calculations raced through his mind. He knew he had the money. He had the connections. He had the legal teams. But he also knew something more ominous. The public wanted blood. And Dewey was determined to give it to them. The trial that followed would become a national spectacle, a battleground where truth, rumor, ambition, and strategy collided. But even before the first argument was made, the fall had already begun. His arrest wasn't just a legal defeat. It was a symbolic one. It marked the moment when the architect of the modern mafia faced a system he couldn't intimidate, bribe, or outmaneuver. The early signs, the murmurs, the pressure, the investigations, had grown into a tidal wave. And Luciano, the man who had once controlled the underworld with effortless precision, was now caught in a current he could not stop. The fall had begun, not with a gunshot, but with a knock on a hotel door, a pair of handcuffs, and the cold certainty that the world was about to change. The courtroom became a theater long before the trial even began. Photographers crowded the steps outside, their cameras flashing like lightning against the stone facade. Reporters elbowed one another for the best spot, shouting questions they knew Luciano would never answer. Inside, the air buzzed with a mixture of anticipation and spectacle, as if the entire city were holding its breath, waiting to witness the fall of a legend. This was not just a prosecution, it was a performance, a political display, a carefully crafted battlefield where image mattered as much as evidence. Thomas E. Dewey stood at the center of it all, the ambitious prosecutor whose stern expression and unwavering posture made him appear almost carved from iron. He spoke to the press like a general preparing for war, calling the trial a turning point for the American justice system. To Dewey this was more than a case. It was a crusade. And Lucky Luciano, whether he deserved the charges or not, was the perfect villain for his campaign. When Luciano entered the courtroom for the first time, the atmosphere shifted instantly. He walked with the calm assurance of a man accustomed to power, dressed sharply, his dark hair slicked back, his face expressionless. Despite the handcuffs, despite the swarm of guards, there was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. People in the gallery whispered. Some expected a monster. Others expected a myth. What they saw instead was a controlled, thoughtful man who did not look the part of the king of the vice racket, the newspapers advertised. But the prosecution had a story to tell and they told it relentlessly. Dewey's team presented witness after witness, women from brothels, pimps, madams, small-time criminals, all claiming Luciano was the mastermind behind a sprawling prostitution empire that stretched across the city. Many of these testimonies were contradictory. Some were embellished. Some were outright lies shaped by fear, promises, or desperation. But the details didn't matter. What mattered was the image being painted. Luciano as a shadowy figure pulling the strings of an invisible empire, a man too powerful to touch until now. Luciano's lawyers fought back with precision. They argued the testimonies were coerced, unreliable, purchased with deals and threats. They reminded the court that Luciano had never been arrested for prostitution rackets before. They pointed out that none of the witnesses had ever seen Luciano in the brothels they claimed he owned. They emphasized that Luciano was being targeted because of his reputation, not because of evidence. And in many ways they were right. Yet the tide of public opinion had already turned. The newspapers had spent months portraying Luciano as a symbol of corruption eating away at New York. Stories exaggerated his wealth, dramatized his power, and painted him as a man who controlled everything from gambling to narcotics to political elections. They made him larger than life, and the more monstrous they made him, the more heroic Dewey appeared. The courtroom increasingly felt like a stage play with Dewey as the noble crusader and Luciano as the villain whose arrogance would be his undoing. Every time Dewey rose to speak, the jurors leaned in. Every time Luciano's defense pointed out inconsistencies, the prosecutors countered with fiery moral arguments. Dewey framed the trial as a moral battle for the soul of the city. And in that kind of war, facts mattered far less than emotion. Luciano sat through it all with the patience of a man who had survived worse. He listened carefully, rarely showing frustration, never raising his voice. He whispered only occasionally to his lawyers, his face remaining unreadable. But inside he felt something he had long trained himself to avoid: helplessness. He could control men, money, and alliances. He could control territories, negotiations, even rival bosses. But he could not control a courtroom fueled by public hunger for justice. The turning point of the trial came when one key witness, an emotionally fragile woman who had lived years in brothels, gave a dramatic testimony claiming Luciano personally managed the prostitution ring. Her story shifted multiple times. She admitted under cross-examination that she had never spoken to Luciano directly. Yet her trembling voice, her tears, her moments of fear captivated the courtroom. Dewey used her like a blade, cutting through the defense's arguments, framing Luciano as a predator hidden behind wealth and organization. It didn't matter that her timeline made little sense. It didn't matter that she contradicted previous statements. In the eyes of the jury, in the eyes of the city, she became the face of Luciano's alleged cruelty. Luciano knew then that the outcome was no longer about evidence. The jury deliberated for a painfully short time. When they returned, the courtroom went still. Dewey sat with calm anticipation. Luciano looked straight ahead, expression composed, as if bracing for an impact he no longer expected to avoid. The verdict: guilty on 62 counts. A wave of murmurs swept the room. Some spectators gasped. Others nodded grimly, satisfied. Dewey maintained his composure, but the gleam in his eyes betrayed the triumph he felt. Luciano's fate was sealed. When the judge delivered the sentence, 30 to 50 years in prison, the courtroom erupted. Reporters dashed out to send the news. Dewey shook hands with his team. Members of the public whispered to one another, marveling at the fall of the century's most infamous gangster. The sentence wasn't just harsh. It was monumental. It ensured Luciano would grow old behind bars if he survived at all. As guards moved in to take him away, Luciano turned briefly to look at the gallery. His face held no anger, no fear, only a quiet acceptance. He had always known that one day the world might catch up to him. But he never expected it to happen like this, not through betrayal, not through violence, but through a courtroom where narrative mattered more than truth. As he was led away in chains, cameras clicked, capturing the image that would travel across newspapers the next morning. Lucky Luciano, the mastermind of the American Mafia, brought low before the nation. The trial ended, but its impact was only beginning. The empire Luciano built would shift, fracture, adapt. The commission would survive, the Mafia would continue, but the man who designed its blueprint was now behind bars, facing the greatest test of his life. His downfall had arrived not with gunfire, but with testimony, strategy, and the cold machinery of a system determined to make an example out of him. Prison was supposed to be the end of Lucky Luciano. The prosecutors believed it, the public believed it, and even many within the underworld whispered that his reign was finished. Behind stone walls and steel bars, far from the smoke-filled backrooms where he once negotiated power, he was expected to fade into irrelevance like so many fallen kings before him. But Luciano had never been the kind of man who allowed his surroundings to dictate his influence. Prison did not break him. It transformed him. From the moment he stepped into Dannemora, known to convicts as Little Siberia for its brutal cold, harsh conditions and unforgiving discipline, he understood that survival required adaptation. He was no longer the boss surrounded by loyal soldiers. Here he was inmate number 92168, stripped of his fine suits, denied his freedom, watched by guards who saw him not as a dangerous mastermind but as a trophy seized by the state. The floors were lined with iron rails, the air thick with the smell of sweat and decay, and the sound of slamming steel doors echoed like distant thunder. It was a far cry from the world he once commanded. Yet even inside these walls, something curious happened. Luciano never lost his composure. He walked through the cell blocks with the same quiet confidence he carried in the outside world. Other inmates noticed. Some feared him. Others respected him. They whispered stories about who he was, what he had done, how he had shaped the underworld like a sculptor shapes clay. And in the prison hierarchy, a universe with its own rules and power dynamics, Reputation mattered more than freedom. Word spread quickly that Luciano was not a man to be bothered. He wasn't violent. He didn't pick fights. He didn't brag. But his presence, his aura, his calmness sent a message stronger than brute force. He understood power in ways most men never would. And because prison was its own kind of society, with alliances, favors, and unwritten rules, Luciano soon found himself navigating this miniature world as effortlessly as he had navigated the streets of New York. He observed everything. The guards who accepted bribes. The inmates who controlled gambling or smuggling. The subtle tensions that simmered between different groups. And though he never asserted himself openly, he began to build quiet relationships. A guard looking for extra income found Luciano to be a generous employer. An inmate facing threats found him to be a surprising source of protection. Bit by bit, Luciano wove a web of influence, not for domination but for stability. He had no intention of ruling the prison. He simply wanted to survive with dignity, and to stay connected to the world he had helped build. Outside the walls, the commission continued to function, surprisingly stable despite the absence of its architect. This was the ultimate validation of Luciano's design. The very system he created, decentralized, collaborative, structured, meant that one man's fall did not trigger collapse. The families kept their territories. The alliances remained intact. Disputes were settled without escalating into war. The machine ran on, steady and disciplined. But while the organization did not crumble, it still felt the void of Luciano's presence. His lieutenants visited him whenever possible. Frank Costello brought political news. Meyer Lansky provided updates on the gambling operations. Trusted messengers relayed information about tensions within the families or whispers from rivals. These meetings were conducted carefully, discreetly, under the watchful eyes of guards who understood far less than they thought they did. From his prison cell, Luciano played a role few expected. He became the quiet stabilizer of the underworld. He advised, not commanded. Suggested, not ordered. Yet his words carried weight. The men who visited him respected his intellect more than they feared his power. Even from behind bars, he was considered the mind of the Mafia, the man whose perspective could prevent a feud or encourage a profitable venture. His influence was subtle, invisible to the authorities, but undeniable among the families. In the stillness of prison nights, he would sit on his narrow cot, staring at the wall as the echoes of distant shouts faded away. He reflected on the life he had lived, the empire he built, the friends he trusted, the enemies he outmaneuvered. He knew he was paying a price, a heavy one, but he refused to let bitterness consume him. He understood the rules of the game better than anyone. Power always demanded sacrifice. And if his sacrifice ensured the survival of the system he created, then the sentence, no matter how long, was just another chapter in his story. But prison did more than restrict his body, it sharpened his vision. With time stripped of distractions, he saw patterns more clearly. He realized that the old ways of the Mafia, dominance through fear, rejection of outsiders, blind adherence to bloodlines, were destined to crumble. The structure he created needed evolution. He dreamed of further reforms, tighter alliances, broader enterprises. Even in confinement, his mind reached outward, always building, always imagining. In the early 1940s, as World War II engulfed the world, another unexpected shift occurred. The U.S. government faced threats along its coastlines, saboteurs, spies, the fear of foreign infiltration. American intelligence discovered something astonishing. The Mafia controlled many of the docks, shipping routes, and workers who could help secure the ports. And at the center of those networks, despite being imprisoned, was Lucky Luciano. Suddenly, the man the government had publicly condemned became a resource they desperately needed. Officials approached him discreetly, using intermediaries to gauge his willingness to cooperate. Luciano saw the opportunity instantly. Not for freedom, he was too wise to expect miracles, but for leverage. He provided information, connections, and influence that helped secure the New York docks from potential sabotage. His cooperation was quiet, shadowed, but effective. It was the kind of arrangement that only a man like him could have navigated, a man who understood both the underworld and the world above it. In prison, Luciano had lost his empire, his freedom, his public image. But he had not lost the one thing that had carried him from the Sicilian alleys to the heights of American organized crime: the ability to shape events from the shadows. He remained, even behind bars, what he had always been: a strategist, a survivor, a man whose influence transcended walls and whose legacy refused to die. The war that pulled Lucky Luciano back into relevance began with fear spreading along America's coastline. German submarines lurked in the Atlantic and unexplained fires, missing cargo and whispers of sabotage stirred panic. The U.S. government realized something uncomfortable. The waterfront, America's lifeline, was controlled not by officials but by the Mafia. And the man who still commanded respect across that network despite being locked away was Luciano. The approach came quietly through intermediaries, lawyers, union figures, men trusted by both the Navy and the underworld. Their message was simple: America needed help. Luciano had no illusions. The government did not come to him out of respect but out of necessity. Still, necessity was leverage. And leverage could shape the future. From inside prison, Luciano coordinated through coded instructions and trusted messengers. Dockworkers tightened vigilance. Sabotage reports dwindled. The Mafia used intimidation, loyalty, and street influence to secure the ports in ways official agencies never could. It was one of history's strangest alliances, the U.S. Navy relying on a man they had sentenced to decades behind bars. When the war ended, whispers grew louder that Luciano had earned something in return. In 1946, in a decision that shocked the nation, Governor Thomas Dewey, the very man who had fought to imprison him, commuted Luciano's sentence. But the freedom came with a cost: immediate deportation. No return to the United States. No second chance at the empire he built. As he boarded the ship to Italy, Luciano stood silent on deck, watching the shoreline fade. America had made him powerful, then thrown him out. Now he was returning to a country he barely remembered, a place he left as a poor boy and returned to as an infamous exile. Italy greeted him with curiosity and caution. To some he was a legend, to authorities a problem. The country was riddled with post-war poverty, black markets, and smuggling rings, opportunities Luciano instantly recognized. He advised quietly, made connections, and watched the cigarette smuggling trade explode, though under constant surveillance from both Italian authorities and American intelligence. Restless, he sought escape in Cuba, a paradise where Meyer Lansky was building gambling empires. For a short while, Luciano tasted the thrill of influence again. Havana welcomed him like royalty. He attended meetings, sat in luxurious casinos, and rekindled the feeling of being at the heart of a criminal network. But the United States intervened. Under pressure, Cuban authorities expelled him. Once again he was forced back to Italy, carrying the sharp sting of a door permanently shut. In Naples his life became quieter, slower. He still spoke with visitors, criminals, admirers, old friends, but the empire was no longer his to shape. He walked the streets with a mix of nostalgia and resignation, a man who could see the past more clearly than the future. The Commission in America continued operating under the structure he created, yet he could only watch from afar, an architect barred from his own creation. Despite the isolation he never fully disconnected. His mind remained sharp, his advice sought by men who still recognized him as the strategist who changed everything. But exile softened his edges. He lived in modest rooms, spent mornings by the sea, and tried to make peace with the life he left behind. He remained caught between worlds, admired, monitored, respected, exiled. A man whose influence reached across oceans even as time slowly pushed him into the background. And though he could no longer stand at the center of power, he understood something that made exile bearable. The empire still lived. The structure still worked. His blueprint had survived. And that meant his legacy, whether praised or condemned, was already impossible to erase. Exile aged Lucky Luciano faster than any prison ever could. In Naples, he lived among crowds that recognized his name but not the weight of his shadow. The city moved with its usual rhythm, markets buzzing, scooters weaving, voices echoing through narrow alleys, yet Luciano walked through it quietly, like a man drifting between past and present. Gone were the nights of strategy meetings, the smoke-filled rooms, the subtle gestures that once shifted the balance of power in America. Now, his influence was something carried only in memories and whispers. He spent long hours in his modest apartment, replaying his life like scenes from a lost film. He thought of the men he trusted, the betrayals he survived, and the empire he reshaped with intellect rather than bullets. Occasionally, young criminals or curious admirers visited him, seeking advice or validation. Luciano listened politely but spoke little. He knew he no longer belonged to the world they wished to inherit. The United States was beyond his reach. The Commission operated without him. Yet the structure was unmistakably his, a silent reminder that his mind still lived inside every decision made by the Mafia he forged. He briefly found renewed purpose in Cuba, where old allies welcomed him with respect. But the American government forced him out once again, returning him to Italy's shores. Another reminder. He could roam the world, but he could not escape his past. In 1962, at the Naples airport, while meeting a film producer interested in telling his story, Luciano collapsed mid-conversation. His heart finally surrendered after decades of pressure. He died far from the streets that once bent to his will. Yet his legacy, complex, dark, brilliant, continued to ripple through history long after his final breath. Death did little to quiet the legend of Lucky Luciano. Instead, it sharpened it. As the years passed, he became more than the architect of the modern mafia. He became a myth, an example studied by criminologists, historians, corporate strategists, and filmmakers alike. The commission he built continued to operate, its structure unchanged, its rules still reflecting his ideas about cooperation, profit, and power. Even as new bosses rose and fell, Luciano's influence remained woven into the foundation of organized crime. His system was so strong that prosecutors later used it as a blueprint to understand and dismantle the mafia. Ironically, the brilliance that made him powerful also made him unforgettable. Hollywood immortalized pieces of him in characters who blended charm with calculation. To the public, he became the image of the dapper Don, calm, intelligent, unshakable. But in truth, Luciano was far more complicated. He was a man forged by poverty, sharpened by ambition, and elevated by his ability to see the world differently than anyone around him. His legacy sits at the intersection of admiration and condemnation. Some praise his strategic mind, his ability to bring order to chaos. Others condemn the suffering his empire caused. Both sides are right. Luciano lived in the gray, never fully hero or villain, always something in between. He spent his final years in exile, far from the machine he built, but even then his shadow stretched across oceans. When he died, his body was returned to New York, the place that made and unmade him. And in the end, his story remains a reminder that power is not only built with violence, it can be built with ideas. Luciano reshaped crime by thinking bigger, and the world has never forgotten the man who saw structure where others saw chaos.